Daniel Reyes had always believed fear was nothing more than the human mind failing to understand reality. For years, he worked as an investigative journalist, exposing fake cults, paranormal scams, and murder cases hidden beneath supernatural rumors. To him, every mystery eventually led back to ordinary human corruption. As his old Chevrolet climbed the winding mountain roads toward Hollow Creek, Arkansas, a thin rain drifted from the gray sky like cold ash. The Ozark pine forest stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, tall and motionless like black walls. The radio crackled with static, interrupted by the faint voice of an old man slowly reading numbers. Daniel switched it off with a sigh. Everything has a logical explanation. The sentence sounded firm when he said it, but the forest outside felt too silent to fully believe it. Hollow Creek looked like a town that had been forgotten by time. An abandoned gas station sat beside the road with rusted pumps dripping rainwater. The Crimson Pine Motel leaned slightly to one side, its red neon sign flickering slowly like a dying heartbeat. The town center held only a small grocery store, an empty wooden church with peeling white paint, and a handful of residents who stared at Daniel a little too long without expression. They were not welcoming, but they did not try to drive him away either. Martha, the elderly motel owner, handed him a room key while staring at the recorder hanging from his shoulder. "Don't listen to the woods at night," she said flatly, almost as if she were reading from a script. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm only here for facts." Martha did not answer immediately. She simply stared at him for several seconds too long before quietly replying, "Everyone here said the same thing." During his first 2 days, Daniel gathered interviews and archived reports about the disappearances. People had been vanishing in Hollow Creek since 1971. Farmers, teachers, teenagers, even a local pastor. Every case shared the same disturbing pattern. Before disappearing, the victims were reportedly heard talking to themselves for days. Some neighbors claimed the victims responded to voices nobody else could hear. Daniel interviewed retired Sheriff Colton Briggs inside an almost empty diner that smelled of stale coffee and wet wood. Colton looked nervous the moment the recorder turned on. "They start hearing it from the forest," he muttered quietly. "Not monsters, not ghosts, voices." Daniel leaned forward. "Whose voices?" The old sheriff stared into his coffee for a long time before answering. "Someone they trust, their mother, their husband, their child." His eyes slowly lifted toward Daniel. "Sometimes their own." On the third night, Daniel entered the pine forest carrying an analog recorder and a VHS camera. Thick fog drifted low between the trees like cold smoke. There were no insects, no wind, only the sound of his boots sinking into wet soil. He kept speaking into the recorder to stay focused. Possible acoustic distortion caused by... He stopped abruptly. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woman was crying softly. Daniel stood still, listening. The crying slowly shifted into whispering. "Daniel," his jaw tightened. "Cheap prank," he muttered. Yet when he replayed the recording minutes later, the voice had changed completely. It was no longer a woman. It was his own voice whispering quietly through static. "Don't go home." The next morning, Hollow Creek felt wrong in ways Daniel could no longer rationalize. The townspeople had begun speaking with identical rhythm and tone. Too calm, too measured. Every conversation carried strange pauses, as if each person waited for instructions before answering. Inside the grocery store, a little boy watched Daniel from behind a shelf and smiled faintly. "You hear it now," the child said in a voice that sounded unnaturally old. Daniel ignored him, but that night his recorder turned on by itself inside the motel room. A conversation played through the speakers that Daniel had never recorded. Footsteps, heavy breathing. Then his own voice whispered clearly, "It's behind the door." Daniel immediately opened the motel room door. The hallway outside was empty beneath flickering fluorescent lights. But from somewhere far down the corridor came soft laughter spoken with Daniel's exact voice. Sleep deprivation slowly poisoned his mind. Daniel forced himself to remain rational, building theories involving radio frequencies, mass psychosis, or coordinated manipulation by the residents. But every new recording made those explanations feel weaker. The tapes changed on their own overnight. Entire sections vanished. New voices appeared where silence once existed, whispering layered endlessly over itself. One night, while listening carefully through headphones, Daniel noticed something that made his stomach tighten with dread. None of the voices breathed correctly. Every pause felt unnatural. Too long. Too empty. Like something trying to imitate human speech without understanding how humans inhale between words. On the sixth night, Daniel discovered the abandoned home of the latest victim, Eleanor Voss, near the edge of the forest. The house smelled of mildew and rotten wood. An old cassette recorder still sat on the kitchen table. After replacing the batteries, the tape began to play through waves of distorted analog static. At first, Eleanor sounded terrified, mumbling to herself while crying softly. Then another voice answered her. It sounded exactly like Eleanor, except it repeated her final words a fraction too late, like an echo learning how to become human in real time. "I'm here," Eleanor whispered. "I'm here," the second voice repeated. The recording ended with a violent crash followed by Eleanor screaming, "You are not me." Afterward came only static and the sound of breathing directly beside the microphone. Daniel eventually became afraid of speaking at all. Human voices in Hollow Creek no longer sounded fully human. The townspeople spoke like damaged copies of living people. Their lips moved slightly behind their words, as though the sound arrived first and their bodies struggled to catch up. At the diner, Martha called Daniel's name without even turning toward him. The moment he answered, every person in the room slowly looked at him simultaneously. Then, in identical monotone voices, they all said together, "Your voice is changing." Daniel left immediately, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Outside, the fog had thickened so heavily that the streetlights floated like blurred moons in white emptiness. From somewhere deep within the forest, dozens of voices began calling his name. His mother's voice, his ex-girlfriend's voice, his co-workers. One by one, the voices slowly merged together until only one remained, his own. The final night in Hollow Creek felt like a rotting fever dream. Daniel locked himself inside the motel room and shoved towels beneath the door to block out the sounds outside. He no longer trusted any voice he heard, including his own breathing. The recorder on the table continued playing random fragments from his investigation without being touched. In one recording, Daniel heard himself calmly saying, "The longer you listen to it, the more of you it takes." He had no memory of speaking those words. The motel lights flickered weakly overhead. Somewhere inside the walls, old wood creaked slowly, as if something were crawling through them. Then footsteps stopped directly outside his door. 3 soft knocks followed. Daniel froze. Silence swallowed the room. Then a voice spoke from the other side of the door. Daniel, it was his own voice. Not similar, not close. Exactly his voice. Every breath, every tone, every imperfection. "Daniel, open the door." At that exact moment, the recorder on the table suddenly activated and began replaying the sounds of Daniel sitting in the room in real time. His breathing, the nervous movement of his fingers, even the faint trembling heartbeat hidden beneath his shirt. As if something outside the door was recording him live. Another knock came, closer this time. "It's okay," the voice whispered gently. "I just want to come inside." Daniel slowly backed away while covering his ears with both hands, but the voice no longer came only from outside. It echoed through the air vent, through the broken radio, beneath the bed, inside the recorder. And worst of all, one of the voices had begun speaking from Daniel's own mouth without his control. "Open the door." Father Gabriel arrived in the small mountain town of Black Hollow, Arkansas, during the final week of October. Rain poured endlessly across the empty roads, turning the forest paths into rivers of black mud beneath the towering Ozark pines. The town itself felt abandoned despite the lights glowing behind old windows. Nobody smiled. Nobody welcomed him properly. They only watched silently as he carried his bags into St. Mercy Church, a rotting wooden chapel standing alone at the edge of the woods. The previous priest, Pastor Elias, had died suddenly 3 weeks earlier under circumstances the diocese refused to explain. Gabriel was young, devoted, and eager to restore faith in the isolated community. But from the moment he stepped inside the church, something felt deeply wrong. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and candle smoke, even though no candles had been lit for days. The church remained strangely empty every night. Morning sermons attracted a handful of exhausted-looking townspeople, but after sunset, nobody came near the building. Not even the local children crossed the churchyard after dark. Gabriel asked an elderly woman named Miriam why the church bell occasionally rang by itself in the middle of the night. Her expression tightened instantly. "You should not answer it," she whispered. "Answer what?" Gabriel asked. Miriam only stared at the dark forest behind the church windows before quietly muttering, "The knocking." That same night, at exactly midnight, the church bell rang once, then twice, then continuously for almost a full minute, echoing through the valley like a warning carried across the mountains. Gabriel searched the bell tower immediately, expecting vandals or faulty machinery, but the tower was empty. Rain hammered against the roof while the heavy bronze bell swayed gently on its own above him. As he reached toward the rope, he noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden beams overhead. Circles surrounding twisted figures with hollow faces. Some carvings looked ancient, much older than the church itself. When Gabriel touched one of the symbols, he realized the wood beneath his fingers felt damp, freshly damp. He pulled his hand away and stared in horror at the dark red stain covering his fingertips. Blood. The next morning, Gabriel visited the town cemetery after hearing rumors about a funeral that had been secretly canceled. Near the far edge of the graveyard, he discovered an open grave abandoned beside a pine tree. Muddy footprints surrounded it, but there was no coffin. Sheriff Boyd reluctantly explained that certain families in Black Hollow refused traditional burials. "Some people here believe the dead shouldn't stay underground after midnight," the sheriff muttered nervously. Gabriel demanded a clearer explanation, but Boyd abruptly walked away before answering. That evening, Gabriel noticed several pages had been violently torn from the church Bible near the Book of Revelation. Deep scratches marked the remaining pages as though someone had clawed at the paper with their fingernails. While cleaning Pastor Elias's old office, Gabriel discovered a locked drawer hidden beneath the desk. Inside were dozens of handwritten journal entries wrapped carefully in black cloth. Most described strange rituals performed by the town's earliest settlers during the 1800s. According to the journals, Black Hollow was built over sacred ground once feared by indigenous tribes long before European settlers arrived. The settlers reportedly heard voices calling from the forest during winter nights. Entire families disappeared after following those voices into the woods. Near the bottom of the final journal entry, Gabriel found a sentence written repeatedly across the page in trembling handwriting. "Do not let them inside after midnight." The sentence appeared so many times that the ink had torn through the paper. Gabriel tried dismissing the journals as the paranoid writings of a dying man, but the disturbances inside the church intensified every night. The bell rang more frequently. Heavy footsteps echoed through empty hallways after midnight. Sometimes he heard whispering beneath the floorboards during prayer. One stormy evening, the church doors began shaking violently as if dozens of people were pounding against them from outside. Gabriel rushed toward the entrance, expecting frightened townspeople seeking shelter from the rain. But when he looked through the narrow glass windows, nobody stood outside. Only darkness and endless rain. Then came a voice. "Father, let us in." It sounded like a frightened child. Then another voice joined it, then dozens more, all whispering together beneath the storm. "Let us in." Gabriel backed away from the doors in terror as the voices slowly changed. Some sounded elderly, some sounded female, some sounded almost inhuman, speaking with distorted tones like broken recordings. Among them, Gabriel suddenly recognized Pastor Elias's voice, weak, trembling. "Don't open the door," the dead priest whispered desperately. "They are not people anymore." The pounding intensified violently, causing dust to rain from the ceiling beams. Gabriel grabbed a crucifix with shaking hands and began praying loudly, but the voices outside only laughed softly in response. One of them whispered directly beside his ear, despite nobody standing near him. "Faith won't help you here." The following day, Gabriel confronted the townspeople during Sunday service. He demanded the truth about the rituals, the disappearances, and the strange midnight warnings. The congregation sat completely silent beneath the dim candlelight. Finally, Miriam stood slowly from the front pew. "The settlers made an agreement long ago," she said calmly. "The forest takes someone every few years. In return, the town survives." Gabriel stared at her in disbelief. You sacrificed people? Miriam's expression remained cold and emotionless. Not people, she replied quietly. Not after they hear the voices. Several members of the congregation slowly turned toward Gabriel at the exact same time. Their faces looked exhausted, pale, and deeply hollow beneath their eyes. Pastor Elias heard them too, one man whispered. That night, Gabriel locked every door and window inside St. Mercy Church. He burned Pastor Elias's journals in the fireplace and prayed until his voice became raw with exhaustion. Midnight approached slowly while thunder rolled across the mountains. Then the church bell began ringing again above him. Loud, violent, unnatural. The front doors shook as countless fists hammered from outside. Gabriel held the crucifix tightly while reciting scripture through trembling breaths. Suddenly, the pounding stopped completely. Silence filled the church. Then came 3 soft knocks. Very gentle, very human. Father Gabriel, it was his mother's voice, the same warm voice from his childhood. We're cold out here. Gabriel's eyes filled with tears as he stared at the trembling church doors. Then another voice spoke beside it. Pastor Elias, don't trust the voices. A third voice followed immediately after. This time it was Gabriel's own voice. Open the door. Dr. Clara Bennett arrived in Black Hollow, Arkansas, believing rural medicine would be simple compared to the chaos of big city hospitals. She was 28, brilliant and deeply committed to science. The isolated mountain town sat beneath endless forests of dark Ozark pines, wrapped in cold fog that rarely lifted even during daylight. Black Hollow only had a single medical clinic, an aging brick building beside an abandoned church and a muddy road leading toward the swamplands beyond town. The locals barely spoke to Clara during her first week. They answered questions with nervous smiles and avoided eye contact whenever the subject of nighttime came up. At first, Clara blamed it on small-town paranoia, but then the patients started arriving. The first patient was a teenage boy named Owen Grady. He entered the clinic pale and trembling, with deep scratches running across both arms and chest. The wounds looked almost animal-like, but strangely precise, as if made by something carefully mimicking claws instead of naturally creating them. Owen refused to explain how he was injured. He only stared blankly at the examination room window while whispering repeatedly, "It keeps knocking." Clara assumed severe psychological distress mixed with self-harm behavior. She cleaned the wounds, prescribed sedatives, and recommended psychiatric evaluation. Before leaving, Owen grabbed her wrist tightly enough to hurt. "Don't answer the window after midnight," he whispered. Within days, more patients appeared with similar symptoms: severe insomnia, bleeding ears, sudden loss of voice despite healthy vocal cords. Some patients stared into empty corners of the clinic as though listening to conversations nobody else could hear. Others suffered violent panic attacks whenever darkness approached outside the windows. Nearly all of them described the same thing. Every night, something knocked softly on their windows. 3 slow knocks, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Clara remained rational through all of it. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Fear spreads easily in isolated communities. The human brain was fragile under stress. Science had explanations for everything. Then the deaths began. The first body arrived during a thunderstorm. A middle-aged farmer named Walter Pike had apparently collapsed in his own bedroom. Sheriff Boyd brought the corpse directly to the clinic because the nearest hospital was over 3 hours away through the mountains. Clara performed the autopsy alone while rain hammered against the clinic windows. The moment she opened the chest cavity, she froze. The organs looked wrong. Every organ inside Walter's body appeared shriveled and unnaturally dry, as though all moisture had been drained from within him. His lungs contained thick black mud mixed with swamp water despite no evidence of drowning. Most disturbing of all, both ear canals were filled with fresh blood originating deep inside the skull. Clara refused to panic. There had to be a medical explanation: environmental contamination, rare fungal infection, toxic exposure from the swamp. But every laboratory test came back inconclusive. No bacteria, no poison, no known disease. As she reviewed Walter's medical records late one evening, the clinic lights flickered violently overhead. Somewhere down the dark hallway came the faint sound of knocking. 3 slow taps. Clara looked toward the frosted hallway window. Knock, knock, knock. When she opened the door moments later, Nobody stood outside, only heavy fog drifting across the empty parking lot. That night, Clara could not sleep. Around 2:13 a.m., soft knocking echoed from the apartment window above the clinic where she lived alone. Her heartbeat immediately quickened. She forced herself to stay calm and approached the curtains carefully. Probably tree branches, she muttered under her breath. But there were no trees near the window. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate, human. Clara pulled the curtain aside abruptly. Nothing, only darkness. Then she noticed a shape reflected faintly in the glass behind her. Someone standing inside the apartment. She spun around instantly, but the room was empty. The next morning, another patient arrived, unable to speak. Maya Collins, a local waitress, sat trembling on the examination table while blood slowly leaked from her left ear. Clara asked what happened, but Maya only scribbled shaky sentences onto a notepad. "I talks through the window. It knows your name. Don't let it hear you answer." As Clara continued reading, Maya suddenly began clawing violently at her own throat while staring toward the clinic window in absolute terror. Nurses restrained her as she screamed soundlessly, tears pouring down her face. Then every light inside the clinic abruptly shut off at once. For several seconds, the building fell completely silent. Then came knocking from every window simultaneously. Clara's scientific certainty slowly began collapsing under the weight of things she could no longer explain. She discovered old medical records hidden beneath the clinic basement, dating back nearly 50 years. Every few decades, Black Hollow experienced outbreaks of the same symptoms: paranoia, insomnia, auditory hallucinations, bleeding ears, and sudden unexplained death. Most victims claimed they heard knocking at night shortly before deteriorating mentally. One final document, written by a doctor who disappeared in 1983, contained only a single sentence repeated across multiple pages. "It imitates the voices of the living." That evening, Clara performed another autopsy after a teenage girl died suddenly in her sleep. Inside the victim's lungs, Clara again discovered wet swamp soil mixed with black water. But this time there was something else. Tiny strands of pine needles buried deep inside the throat, as if the girl had inhaled an entire forest while sleeping. Clara staggered backward from the table in horror. Then she heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the autopsy room window directly behind her. Slowly, Clara turned around. Outside the glass stood the silhouette of a person, tall, motionless, its face hidden by darkness. Then it spoke in her dead mother's voice. "Clara, open the window." Clara backed away, trembling violently, unable to breathe. Tears filled her eyes as the voice continued softly through the glass. Gentle, loving, familiar, exactly how her mother had sounded before dying years earlier. The figure outside never moved, yet the knocking continued somehow beneath the voice. Knock, knock, knock. Then the clinic lights flickered again. For a split second, Clara finally saw the thing outside clearly. It had no face at all. Only smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over where its features should have been, but its mouth still moved beneath the skin when it spoke. And now, it was using Clara's own voice. "Open the window." Hank Miller had spent most of his life working construction jobs across the back roads of the American South. He was 42, broad-shouldered, foul-mouthed, and practical to the point of cruelty. Ghost stories meant nothing to him. Religion meant even less. When the Arkansas Department of Transportation hired his crew to renovate an abandoned mountain road outside Black Hollow, he expected nothing more than 12-hour shifts, bad coffee, and miserable weather. The locals warned them constantly about the forest surrounding the old highway, but Hank dismissed every story with a laugh. "People around here need hobbies," he muttered, while unloading equipment beneath the endless Ozark pine trees. The woods stretched for miles in every direction, silent except for the distant sound of wind moving through dead branches like low whispering voices. The project began normally during the first week. Bulldozers cleared mudslides while workers replaced cracked asphalt along the old road leading toward the swamps north of town. But strange things started happening once the crew reached a section of collapsed hillside near the forest. Tools disappeared overnight. Fresh footprints appeared around the site every morning despite no sign of trespassers. One worker claimed he heard people talking deep in the woods after midnight, even though nobody was there. Hank blamed exhaustion and too much alcohol. "This place just gets inside your head," he told the crew while smoking beside the floodlights one evening. Yet even Hank privately admitted the forest felt wrong after dark. Too quiet, too watchful. 3 days later, an excavator broke through the ground while clearing debris near the hillside. Instead of solid rock beneath the mud, the machine exposed the entrance to a narrow concrete tunnel buried beneath decades of dirt and roots. The opening descended into darkness beneath the mountain. Sheriff Boyd arrived almost immediately and demanded the site be sealed, but Hank refused until the state inspectors arrived. "Could be an old military tunnel," Hank argued, "or moonshine storage." The sheriff's face looked pale beneath the floodlights. "You should leave it alone," Boyd warned quietly. Some things down there were meant to stay buried. Naturally, Hank ignored him. That night, Hank and 2 workers entered the tunnel carrying flashlights and old mining helmets. The underground passage smelled of mildew, rust, and stagnant water. Strange symbols had been carved into the concrete walls from floor to ceiling: spirals, distorted human figures, and shapes resembling trees growing from open mouths. Some carvings looked decades old. Others appeared fresh. The tunnel eventually opened into a hidden, underground chamber reinforced with rotting wooden beams. In the center of the room sat dozens of rusted cassette tapes scattered around a broken recording device covered in dust. One of the workers laughed nervously. "This some Blair Witch crap?" Hank rolled his eyes and picked up a tape labeled simply, "Do not play after dark." "People love messing with idiots," Hank muttered. He played it anyway. At first, the cassette contained only static and faint background noise. Then, a man's voice emerged through heavy distortion. Calm, exhausted, terrified. "If you're hearing this, they already know your voice." The tape crackled loudly before continuing. "They stay in the trees during daylight. Don't look at them too long. Don't follow the sounds. And if you see one standing still..." The recording suddenly cut into violent static. Then came screaming. Not normal screaming. Dozens of overlapping voices crying, begging, and laughing simultaneously. Hank immediately shut the recorder off. Nobody spoke for several seconds afterward. Then one worker quietly whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Hank asked. The worker stared toward the darkness deeper inside the chamber. "It sounded like my wife." The crew abandoned the tunnel immediately after one of the floodlights outside exploded without explanation. Over the following nights, workers began quitting the project one by one. Some claimed they saw figures watching from the tree line beyond the road. Others reported hearing familiar voices calling from the forest after sunset. One man disappeared entirely after wandering away from camp during a storm. His boots were later found standing upright beside the road, filled with swamp water. Hank grew irritated more than frightened. "You people are acting insane," he snapped during an argument at camp. But secretly he had started noticing things too. Every night around 2 a.m., someone knocked softly against his trailer window. 3 slow knocks, always the same rhythm. And every morning, muddy footprints surrounded the trailer despite no tracks leading away. One evening, Hank finally saw the thing in the forest. The crew had been working late under portable floodlights when he noticed a figure standing far beyond the trees near the edge of the swamp. At first, Hank assumed it was another worker. But the longer he stared, the more wrong the shape appeared. The figure was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet high, unnaturally thin, and completely motionless. No face was visible beneath the darkness between the trees. Hank looked away briefly when another worker called his name. When he looked back, the figure had moved closer. Not walking, not running, just suddenly nearer than before, still perfectly motionless. Hank felt cold sweat spread down his back. Over the next several nights, the figure continued appearing around the construction site, always distant, always silent. Workers stopped coming entirely after sunset. Hank began drinking heavily to calm his nerves, but sleep only made things worse. He started hearing voices outside his trailer every night. Familiar voices. His dead brother, former coworkers, his ex-wife. Sometimes they begged him to come outside. Sometimes they simply whispered his name from the woods. One night, Hank finally opened the trailer door holding a shotgun. Nobody stood outside, only the dark forest. Then something spoke directly behind him using Hank's own voice. "You should have left the tunnel closed." Hank turned slowly toward the trees. The tall figure stood only 20 feet away now. Its body remained perfectly still beneath the moonlight. But this time, Hank could finally see its face. There wasn't one. Only smooth flesh stretched tightly across a human-shaped skull. Then, somewhere inside that faceless head, his own voice whispered again, "Look away." Hank blinked instinctively, and when his eyes opened again, the thing was standing directly beside the trailer door. Walter Boone lived alone in a collapsing cabin deep within the swamplands north of Black Hollow, Arkansas. Most people in town avoided him completely. Children crossed the street whenever they saw his rusted truck near the grocery store, and adults lowered their voices whenever his name came up in conversation. He was old, heavily scarred, and carried the smell of swamp water and cigarette smoke everywhere he went. A faded hunting rifle never left his side, not even inside town buildings. Strange symbols made from bone, rope, and carved wood hung around his cabin windows like primitive charms. Some locals claimed Walter had once been a respected hunter before something changed him decades earlier. Others whispered he had survived something in the forest that should have killed him. Daniel Carter, a freelance documentary filmmaker investigating the disappearances around Black Hollow, first met Walter inside a nearly empty gas station during a thunderstorm. Walter stood silently near the coffee machine while rain hammered the roof overhead. The old man's eyes immediately drifted toward the camera equipment hanging from Daniel's shoulder. "You're asking the wrong questions around here," Walter muttered without introducing himself. Daniel smirked slightly. "I'm just filming local stories." Walter lit a cigarette with rough, shaking hands and stared out toward the dark highway. "If it was only bears out there," he said quietly, "this town wouldn't be afraid of the dark." That sentence stayed with Daniel long after the conversation ended. 2 nights later, Daniel followed muddy tire tracks through the swamp roads until he found Walter's cabin, hidden among dead cypress trees draped in gray moss. Animal bones hung from the porch ceiling beside rusted lanterns and bundles of dried herbs. Strange symbols had been carved into nearly every wooden surface surrounding the house. Some resembled circles crossed with jagged lines. Others looked almost like human figures twisted into unnatural shapes. Walter answered the door holding his rifle casually in one hand. "You journalists never know when to leave things alone," he growled. Daniel ignored the warning and asked directly about the disappearances. Walter remained silent for several seconds before finally replying, "You hear knocking at your window yet?" Daniel's expression immediately changed. Walter noticed. "That means it already knows your voice." Inside the cabin, the walls were covered with old newspaper clippings, maps of the Ozark forests, and photographs dating back almost 50 years. Many photos showed search parties standing beside bodies covered with sheets. Others showed strange markings burned into trees deep in the woods. Walter poured whiskey into 2 dirty glasses while Daniel examined a faded photograph pinned beside the fireplace. It showed a group of hunters standing in front of a massive cave entrance sometime during the 1970s. One face had been violently scratched out. "Who's that?" Daniel asked quietly. Walter's expression darkened immediately. Someone who listened too long. As the storm worsened outside, Walter finally began talking. According to him, Black Hollow had always been wrong. Long before the town existed, indigenous tribes avoided the surrounding swamps and forests completely. Settlers who arrived during the 1800s reported hearing voices at night calling from beyond the trees. Entire families disappeared after following those sounds into the wilderness. At first, people blamed animals, outlaws, or madness. Then the bodies started appearing. Victims were often found miles from town with bleeding ears, collapsed lungs filled with swamp water, and expressions frozen in absolute terror. Some survivors claimed the forest could imitate human voices perfectly. Others insisted the voices came from something buried beneath the hills. Daniel remained skeptical despite the growing tension in the cabin. "So what exactly are you saying?" he asked. "That some creature copies people's voices?" Walter stared directly into the fireplace flames before answering. "It doesn't just copy voices." His tone became quieter. "It learns people." The old hunter explained that the thing in the forest never attacked immediately. First, it listened. It stayed hidden among the trees at night, repeating familiar voices softly from a distance. The longer someone listened, the more the imitation improved. Eventually, victims could no longer tell the difference between real voices and false ones. "That's when it gets close," Walter whispered. Daniel noticed several heavy locks attached to every cabin door and window, despite the remote location. Near midnight, Walter abruptly stood from his chair and closed every curtain inside the house. "Nobody goes outside after dark," he said firmly. The old hunter then loaded fresh ammunition into his rifle with slow, practiced movements. Daniel laughed nervously. "You seriously believe bullets help?" Walter glanced toward the dark windows. "No," he replied, "but the sound reminds me I'm still human." A sudden knocking interrupted the conversation. 3 slow taps against the cabin wall. Daniel froze. Walter did not react immediately. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again from the rear window facing the swamp. Walter calmly extinguished the lantern beside him and motioned for silence. The cabin plunged into darkness, except for weak firelight flickering across the walls. Outside, something moved slowly through the water beyond the house. Daniel heard soft footsteps circling the cabin beneath the rain. Then a woman's voice whispered from outside the window. "Walter." The old hunter's face tightened instantly. Daniel realized the voice sounded genuine, warm, human. "Walter, please let me in." Walter raised the rifle slowly but kept it pointed toward the floor. "That's my wife," he whispered. Daniel stared at him in confusion. "Your wife?" Walter nodded once without looking away from the window. "Been dead 23 years. The voice outside continued speaking softly through the storm. It sounded frightened now. Desperate. "Walter, it's cold out here." Tears quietly formed in the old hunter's eyes, but he never moved toward the door. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed Daniel a folded map marked with symbols and handwritten notes. One location had been circled repeatedly deep within the forest near an abandoned mine entrance. "That's where it sleeps during daylight," Walter muttered. The knocking suddenly stopped. Silence swallowed the cabin. Then another voice spoke outside. This time, it was Daniel's voice. "Open the door, Walter." Daniel's blood went cold. Neither man moved. Slowly, Walter leaned closer and whispered, "Now you understand why this town fears the dark." The storm outside intensified violently. Rain slammed against the cabin roof while unseen footsteps moved through the swamp surrounding the house. Daniel's breathing became uneven as more voices emerged from outside. Different ages, different people, men, women, children, some crying, some laughing softly, all speaking from the darkness beyond the windows. Walter quietly handed Daniel an old flashlight and motioned toward the back door. "If those voices start sounding comforting," he said carefully, "you run." Daniel stared at him. "What about you?" Walter slowly reloaded the rifle again without answering. Then the cabin lights died completely. Only darkness remained, and somewhere outside dozens of voices began whispering together in perfect unison. "Walter Boone." The old hunter closed his eyes for a moment like a man finally exhausted from running. Then he whispered something Daniel could barely hear. "They learned my name a long time ago.